this particular friend, she said, I can't tell him, he'd kill me, which I took as a turn of phrase. But then one day I went to pick up the kids from school where this friend's sister was at work, and everyone asked me, what's happened to Sveta? I was like, I don't know. Well, her sister's just dashed off home. Something's happened to Sveta. And in my heart, I knew what had happened. And my kids are asking, what's wrong with Sveta? What's wrong with Sveta? And as we got to our apartment building, her mum and her sister were just coming out the door, and they said, Sveta's dead.
Hi guys, welcome back to Raw Mission, where we hear from men and women courageously taking the good news of Jesus to the ends of the earth. Unaware of what awaits them, they've chosen a life filled with risk, instability, discomfort and sometimes danger, but they are very aware of who has called them, who has sent them, and who goes with them. And today I'm joined by David and Abigail, who've served in the Caucasus of West Asia for more than a decade. We'll be discussing the role of saunas, alcohol and witchcraft amongst the peoples of that region, as well as some of the joys of life in the mountains. But I also want to put out a warning that this episode contains some harrowing stories of domestic abuse, of violence against women. In that regard, it's not suitable for younger children. Well, it's a great joy to have you with us, David and Abigail. Welcome to the studio.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm really excited to talk to you today, not just because we get a husband and wife combinations, we get to hear two perspectives on one story and all the experiences you've had in your region, but also because I've never done a podcast with anyone who's lived where you guys have lived, so hopefully that'll be intriguing for our listeners. They're thinking, okay, where's this going to be then? But it is the Muslim world, but it's a very unusual and unknown part of the Muslim world for many of us and many of our listeners. So yeah, let's take it back a little bit. How did you get called or drawn into this kind of work and this kind of ministry?
I think I better answer that because it's mainly my fault. When I was 12 at school, I was in top set for French, and we were offered to do a second foreign language, and in my year at school that was Russian. So I started learning Russian. To give away some of my age, it was still communist in those days. But by the time I was 14, perestroika and glasnost and all that stuff meant that my school did a school exchange to Moscow.
Wow.
And so I got to stay with a Russian family in Moscow and was just captivated by it. We were there over an Orthodox Easter, and we were taken to an Orthodox church for the Easter service. And I had just become a Christian at that point, and it was such an amazing experience. And I went home from that trip going, I want to go and work in Russia and tell people about Jesus. Oh, wow. But I was 14.
How did your parents react?
Not well, nor did my careers teachers at school, who told me to be serious and decide on a proper career. By the time I was 18 and finished school, communism had collapsed. And so, aged 18, I went with YWAM and did one of their discipleship training schools, and just fell in love with the place.
That was in Russia as well then.
In Russia, yeah. And was like, this is where I want to be. So I joined YWAM, and while I was with YWAM, I found out about unreached people groups, which I had never heard of before, and I certainly didn't know there was any in Russia. And then to find out that the place where I was at in southern Russia was right next to this region of the world called the Caucasus. Now, the Caucasus runs from the Black Sea to the Caspian Sea and includes Russia, Azerbaijan, Georgia and Armenia. And within the borders of all those countries, there are these Muslim unreached people groups. And when I found out that, it was like, well, that's where I need to go. So that's how I felt called to the Caucasus, and David can tell you how he got dragged in too.
Yeah, we got married. We met not in the Caucasus, but in another city somewhere in the middle of the UK. And yeah, we ended up, after being married for a year, going to the region on a very short-term trip to work with a church community there. And while we were there, we were taken up to a high place looking towards the mountains. They were only just visible on the horizon. But while we were there and looking and praying towards this region, I was just completely overwhelmed by a sense of God's love for the people there. I'd done a gap year up before university and been in, other parts of the world in South America, and I'd done a placement year in Europe during my undergrad degree. And whilst I'd been in believing circles in those places, I'd never felt God's love for the people in the way that I did looking towards those mountains. And it was really intense. And so that was that short trip. And it was like, this is not just Abigail's story. This is our story.
Had you been praying for David to catch this vision alongside you?
Well, when he first asked me out, I told him I'm going back to the Caucasus one day, and he didn't run away. So I assumed he was okay with that.
Part of the package.
Part of the package. I did have some other ideas about how that might work out, which at the time I didn't express to her, and which turned out to be nonsense. But God got hold of me at that moment. And it was just, okay, this is where we need to be and where we need to be heading. But it took another 7 or 8 years from that point to actually pack everything up into some suitcases, produce a couple of children on the way, and actually arrive with a 3-year-old and a 5-year-old. Okay.
So, say something then about just the journey you and your church were on in that process of discernment and calling and sending and supporting you to go. Were there some difficulties in just getting them to understand the value of this and so on?
I think they understood the value of it. There was never any sense of, oh no, you're not called to go there. What was, I think, part of the situation, if you like, is that for a number of years there was this kind of unspoken rule that they only sent people who were already on leadership. I think that was sort of what we understood. Whether we were right or not, I'm not sure. And we felt called to cross-cultural mission in another country. And so the realistic options for us to get involved as leaders within the church, we could lead a home group, but it wasn't part of our DNA. And so we were never going to end up being sent through that route. And so we threw ourselves into local work in the city where we lived, and moved into a Muslim neighbourhood and got involved in community work. And then a project that Abigail was involved in, we kind of wanted to go to the church and speak to the leaders and say, hey, we've got this good idea. What do you think? Is there any mileage in it? And their response was, that's really good, but when are you going to the Caucasus? And we said, well, when you send us, we didn't think you were able to send us. And the response came back, well, that's changed now. We're ready to send. And at that point, all of the doors kind of started to fling open.
Yeah, that's really good. I mean, sometimes it's just relational capital with the church. They get you, they've seen you in their context a bit longer. So you end up arriving in the Caucasus. Did you know what you were going to be doing in terms of which visa you were on, or running any kind of business, or what was your sort of way in and your way to live there and be there and have an identity in that place?
Yeah, at that time, it was reasonably easy to go into sort of gateway cities. There were certain universities that were open to foreigners coming and learning language. And we had a contact in country who organised that for us. Sometime later, that changed, and a lot of people who had been on that visa got kicked out, but thankfully we were in a different part of the world by then, and so that didn't affect us. But at that time, it was relatively easy. And then once we were in country, we could look at businesses that we could start to run to continue to have a presence.
Is that what you did? You did small business?
Yeah, so the first few years were on student visas, but as language, and particularly my language, improved, it was, okay, we need to now transition to something that was more sustainable. And actually, we didn't get business visas. We simply went with residency. And that was, lots of toing and froing and bureaucracy. And you'd have several things that you needed to do, but the bureaucracy was such that if you managed to do one of them on a given day, then that was a result.
A lot of sitting and drinking tea, or just people waiting for bribes, or?
No, just deeply inefficient.
Yeah.
Sitting in very crowded waiting rooms with a lot of other people and just waiting your turn to see the bureaucrat who would go through your form, find the first mistake and say, no, this needs changing, without going through the whole form. So you'd go away and change that mistake, and then you'd come back and they'd get through, yes, that's now right. Now here's another mistake. And so you would go back and wait several hours each time for the bureaucrat to decide, oh no, there's this mistake, that mistake. Very, very frustrating.
Yes, I know. I've been brought to almost tears by bureaucracy in Pakistan. It's just...
I would say that by the time we left, actually the system had improved, and there were days when you could get 2 or 3 things done in one day, which you'd come home with a real sense of achievement. I've done 3 things today. I've been to the bank and the medical place and so on.
Definitely get it. And how do people view you guys as Brits there?
So I had a group of friends. I will say this, there's deeply entrenched racism within the community that we were part of. Even as a minority community, they had their own versions of racial superiority. And, you know, I'd have these long conversations. Usually alcohol would have been involved somewhere. And I'd have this conversation where someone would say, oh, we're up here and Russians, they're here. And you're English, you're all right, you're here. But then down here you've got and then there'd be, you know, all your usual racial groups that people around the world despise and don't like. And it was really very marked. And it was interesting and it was surprising, particularly as the people group that we'd been amongst had also been persecuted for their ethnicity within their recent history. And yet they were quite willing to treat and speak about others in basically the same way. And I did push back on that occasionally, but, you know, usually it was in the context of saying, oh, we love you.
Tell us a bit more about the drinking culture there, because it's a bit of a stereotype that in the post-Soviet world that vodka and partying and enjoying life go together, much as in our own culture, you know, Brits and going to the pub and drinking beer is a thing. What was it like?
So I used to get together with a group of guys, and they were all from this same Muslim background. Many of them were older guys who had grown up within the Soviet system, and so were largely non-religious, although they became more so over the years that we were there. And so they drank often very heavily. You know, it wasn't uncommon to see somebody knock back 8 shots in one go. I mean, I couldn't do it, I'd be dead. So there was that side of things, but then there were also people within that same group of friends who were practicing Muslims, didn't drink, didn't smoke, didn't gamble, didn't do all of the stuff that these other guys, these older guys did. And it was a really interesting dynamic. So the sort of head guy, the older guy with the money and the influence, was one of these who was drinking, smoking, and so on and so on. But he had a lot of people who were part of his network, of which he was the main benefactor, I suppose you might call it that.
Like a patron-client thing.
Like a patron-client thing. It was definitely that because, I mean, he ran a number of businesses in the area. But they met up twice a week to just hang out in the, what I suppose you'd call it, a sauna, well, summer house sauna that was owned by one of them, and it was up in the mountains. And so, you know, you'd all meet up and get in the cars and be taken up there. The first time I went up there, I had no idea where I was going. I thought I was being kidnapped. And, and they just hung out and spent time together. And they invited me into that, which was a privilege to some extent. It really opened up how we were seen, I think, in the local community.
How did you cope with the sort of drinking culture there? I mean, this is not what my usual guests are talking about. Drinking with the Muslims that we're trying to reach.
Yeah, so obviously these older guys drank very heavily, spirits and that kind of stuff, and these younger guys who were practicing Muslims didn't drink at all, and they all seemed to rub along quite well together. And then the younger guys would go off for prayers at some point during the evening. They even built a little prayer building. I mean, it's all very contradictory. And so I kind of had to thread this middle way. What does it mean to be a follower of Jesus where all things are possible, but not all things are helpful? And so for those who were drinking very heavily, I decided that, well, they'd already got the sort of Muslim, beard wearing, don't do this kind of thing going on.
People telling them off for what they were doing.
Not exactly telling them off, because you've got an age thing, the younger guys, but disapproving. So I could either choose that, or I could choose, well, actually, I'll drink just a little bit. I won't have strong alcohol. I'll have a wine or a beer or something. And I think they thought me was a bit of a lightweight, but it was, no, all things in, what's the right word?
Moderation.
In moderation, Whereas for the other guys, it was a case of, okay, I don't have to be dissolute and drunken. I can have a little bit, and all things in moderation.
Right.
And so trying to thread that needle.
And overall, they accepted that?
The first little while.
Abigail's smiling, so there's a good story coming here, I think.
the first little while, I don't know how long in it was, but for a long time there was this sort of, no, you must have some vodka, you must have some tequila, you must have some of this, and I would, no, I'll just have a glass of wine, please. And then eventually one evening I went there and there was no beer and there was no wine, and it's unacceptable not to toast. So toasting is a part of the drinking culture, and it's unacceptable to toast with just a glass of water. And so, right, tequila. I'd never drunk tequila before. I haven't drunk it again since. And unfortunately that night they did get me smashed, and I was pretty unwell.
All over the roses.
All over the roses, yes.
Over the roses. Oh my
and
goodness.
What was interesting about it was not the fact that they got me drunk, but the fact that the following morning, one of the older guys, not the main guy, but one of his sidekicks, actually phoned me up and said, "Are you okay?" And over the years, what we've learned is that certainly amongst that people group, you won't necessarily get an apology, but what you get is a change in behaviour. And so they'd achieved their aim, they'd got me drunk, they saw that I was not a very good drunk, certainly in terms of tequila, and that was their story, that was their laugh. They got the English guy drunk, and you're okay, we've checked you're okay. They never did it again, and they understood from that point on that they didn't need to do that. They'd had their laugh at my expense. They were happy, and the relationship could move on. And so, I mean, it would be wonderful to be able to say, "Oh yes," and half of them became followers of Jesus. Sadly, that never happened, but it meant that I had an in within that group of men and had the place to be able to talk about things of faith when I needed to.
Did you say that the sauna is a place where discussion and conversation really takes off?
It's certainly where people are more vulnerable.
Physically,
yeah, absolutely. So if you think your clothes are a kind of protection against the world, and when you take them off, you are more vulnerable. And so you're not wandering around in there totally naked. You've got a towel or a sheet or something wrapped around your middle. But I had more conversations in the sauna of consequence, and particularly with the main guy there, that allowed me to tell Bible stories, and it allowed me to speak into these guys' lives in a way that I wouldn't have had we been sitting in a cafe with our clothes on, frankly.
That's
and this guy on a number of occasions said, "You're a better Muslim than I am," or "You're very wise, you're one of the wisest people I know." And it's like, well, I'm just telling you stories from the scriptures. And he's like, no, you're very wise.
It's interesting because it's the Turkish hammam thing as well, isn't it? The bath thing. I don't know if that's the right word in Turkey, but Morocco as well as that kind of culture. Not where I was in South Asia, but it's really interesting.
So it was a privilege, and I can say I've been skinny dipping in the river with the mayor. It's kind of. I don't know that everyone aspires to that when they go to the mission field, but
not usually in our training manual.
No.
Well, overseen by men with AK-47s.
There were some of those. I got to fire one day. it's totally different, and outside of my experience here in the UK, certainly never shot a gun anywhere else in the world.
Yeah. But, I mean, just going back to when men talk, I mean, that's a huge question even for the church here in the West. And there's a lot of talk going on around, I mean, in our church, men sitting around fire pits will talk much more than men sitting in a small group. And so
and I bet there's a beer involved.
Well, absolutely. There's beer, or, of course, in British culture, go down to the pub and have a chat with your mates, much more likely to get somewhere, and especially for those who do drink a lot, after a few drinks they're more likely to talk about their vulnerabilities. This podcast is not going where I thought it would be going. Our American listeners are probably thinking, what's happening over there? But anyway, Abigail, tell us about the culture of the ladies that you interacted with there. Was it a very different world? You're obviously at this stage, I guess you're a mum of young kids, you're I don't know how involved you were able to be in business or marketplace or outward things. What did your life look like, and what are the women of that people group like?
So in our people group, as in much of the post-Soviet world, under the Soviet system, women were encouraged to go out to work. So there were plenty of women working in shops or as teachers or university professors. It wasn't unusual for women to be out at work. And I did work in our English business.
Was that an English language school?
Women were generally less available in the sense that they were, even though they were encouraged to go out to work, they still had to do all of the home stuff.
Yeah. So getting to know women was not always easy because their life was filled with family, filled with looking after their children, looking after their husbands, looking after their elderly relatives, and then they might be working on top of all of that.
Wow.
So they were not free to go out for coffee very often. There was no sauna for the women. Really? So it could be challenging to get to know people. When we first arrived in our town/village, one of the ladies on our landing in our block of flats befriended me, and she would come over and we would drink tea or coffee, and then both families got to know each other, and that was really nice. But I very soon found out that women, once they feel they have a confidence with you, they will tell you a lot of stuff. And a lot of the women, once you get to know them, you find out about the violence that they live with. So that was very hard.
Can you just explain that a little bit more?
Domestic abuse. So less now, but the women of my age, I quickly realised that one of the get to know you questions that Brits use of how did you meet your husband was not appropriate. I very quickly learnt that the question was, did you know your husband when you married him? Because then you would get a story of how she was kidnapped, and then the women are meant to be given a certain amount of choice about whether they say yes or no to the person who kidnaps them. They have overnight to decide.
Wow.
And I spoke to one woman, she'd turned the same guy down twice, and when the guy kidnapped her the third time, her family told her that it was too dishonourable for the family for her to turn him down 3 times, and was made to marry him. So very quickly that was the question. Once you knew a woman better, then you would say, did you know your husband when you got married? And then you'd hear the story, and some really tragic stories. And violence, domestic abuse would often be part of the story, and that was very, very hard. And this friend we made, the first friend I made in our village, she told me stuff about her life, about before she married the guy who kidnapped her, and about how a relationship had continued after getting married. And she would ask me, what should I do? And I would say, I don't know, because my husband and I, we talk about everything. And this particular friend, she said, I can't tell him, he'd kill me, which I took as a turn of phrase. But then one day I went to pick up the kids from school where this friend's sister was at work. And everyone asked me, what's happened to Sveta? I was like, I don't know. Well, her sister's just dashed off home. Something's happened to Sveta. And in my heart, I knew what had happened. And my kids are asking, what's wrong with Sveta? What's wrong with Sveta? And as we got to our apartment building, her mum and her sister were just coming out the door. And they said, Sveta's dead.
There were police everywhere.
There were police everywhere, and her husband had shot her. And that was just one of the hardest things. And going to her funeral the next day and seeing her body wrapped in a carpet was just indescribable. And then it makes it very hard to keep making friends when you see that kind of thing.
And did that really bring home this sense that this is not just one lady who faced such a tragedy, but they carried this kind of fear hanging over them, so many, if there's just a lot of, I presume, that alcohol-induced violence, as in many countries around the world, these things would have been connected, but not in this particular story, but just generally, if that's a culture of...
This particular story, he was a very strict Muslim.
Okay.
And it was the dishonour that she was going to leave him that brought this on. And we had experienced women suffering domestic abuse when we still lived in a city in England. Just seeing what men can do to women, and then to experience that as well. It makes it very hard, and it makes it hard to keep making friendships when you feel like, oh no, what am I going to find out?
It's secondary trauma, isn't it, as you continue to listen to traumatic stories of friends of yours, people who you love and you care about, and you feel so powerless, really, to... I mean, you're there modelling something different, hopefully, a Christ-like marriage that we try to model, and none of us are perfect in marriages, but, you hope that's part of our gospel witness, being in a culture where marriage looks very different, but at the same time, you're listening to all of this, and that's just a huge weight to bear. Thank you for sharing that. I know that's a cost to you.
We later met a small group of believers from our people group who'd come to faith in Christ, and the ones that were married to guys who were still Muslims, but we did model something different. And I remember one time we were at a big feast, and I was sitting next to David, and he was talking to someone on his side of the table, and I was talking to someone on the other side who asked me a question, and I needed to ask David what he thought about this thing. I can't remember at all what it was now, but I just put my hand on his arm and waited him to finish his sentence and look at me and then ask the question. And this friend was like, wow, that's so amazing, and shouts at her husband, see, that's how to interact. Look at them. And brought everyone's attention to the fact that I had just respectfully let him know that I wanted to say something, but then waited for him to finish speaking, not just speak over him.
And that then I had not ignored her, but had excused myself from the conversation I was having and turned to her.
And valued her.
And so, it worked kind of both ways.
Mutual respect.
Yeah, it was very unusual, wasn't it? They hadn't seen that kind of interaction from anyone.
I mean, that's fascinating, even that in a positive sense you can touch your husband's arm, because in my culture of North Pakistan you can't show any public displays of affection in that sense. We wouldn't be able to be tactile in public at all. But it's just so good for our listeners to hear there are very, very different Muslim cultures all over the world.
Yeah.
You have to learn a lot when you get there.
Another thing is that when we got to our village, we had been told, men and women don't hold hands, they don't show any public affection. And for several years we lived with that, and eventually we kind of went, actually we are married, and all we're doing is holding hands, and there's nothing sinful about holding hands, and so why should we follow this custom? And so we started holding hands. And by the time we left, there were young families walking around the stadium holding hands. And I saw one young couple just walking along the street. He was a university professor, and he was walking home with his new wife, holding hands with his new wife. And, you know, it's just such a tiny thing that we did. But then seeing, other people have started doing that since. And going out to the stadium with our kids. When we first went, men never went out with their kids to the stadium. It was women took the kids. But by the time we left, whole families were going out to the stadium.
That's encouraging.
And
so what would the stadium be?
The stadium is like there's a football pitch
and a running track.
Yeah,
and there were some raised
where
seats.
People hung out.
Well, there was raised seats. It was built in the Soviet era. Yeah. In the time when everyone was competing and being fit, beautiful Soviet people. And, I mean, it was rather ramshackle by the time we were there. But it was a place where people went for a stroll in the evening or in the summer.
Okay. Yeah, really interesting. Yeah, it's fascinating. Just cultural changes and the impact that outsiders can have on communities.
I don't think we were the only influence. I think things were changing on Instagram, which is where everyone got their information from. And this new kind of Islam was coming out where you should look after your wives and children. But I think seeing us do it also spoke that, it's okay to do it here. So, it's amazing what tiny things can be so influential. And then you try and do grand gestures and nothing comes of it.
Yeah. Just a quick question back on maybe my last question, just on the relationships between men and women. When you are talking to the men and the guys in the sauna or wherever, and, you know, out in the evenings, does that topic of conversation ever come up? That how they treat their wives? Or is that just so secretive and shameful that nobody talks about that?
They certainly didn't talk about their wives particularly. I mean, in the local language, if you were talking about your spouse, and I think it was the same for the women, you simply talked about her. You don't name her.
Yes. Even in Pakistan, I would have to say, how's my sister-in-law?
Right, okay.
When I'm really asking, how's your wife?
Yeah.
I mean, I would probably actually say, how's your family?
Where we were, you know, they'd be saying, well, can you come out on Friday? And I said, well, I'm not sure quite what we're doing. I need to just check in with my wife. They saw that as me asking my wife permission, which isn't what I was doing. I was just saying, you know, we're not doing anything this weekend, are we? It's, you know, I'm not missing anything. I need to let you know that I'm probably going to go out. But they kind of saw it as a sort of asking permission, and they did kind of see it as weakness. It wasn't me phoning my wife and telling her that I was going out was also weakness. It's like, why would you tell your wife? You just go. Right. And I'm also aware that they had a number of guys' weekends away, shall we say, in resort towns where they weren't just going for the bracing fresh air, let's say. And, I mean, I was never invited on those, and I wouldn't have gone if I was. But
that speaks volumes that you weren't invited because they knew.
Yeah, well, absolutely. Absolutely.
Have you ever thought about your role in God's great mission to draw all people to himself? There are so many ways you could get involved, even if you don't end up overseas. You could share some of these episodes with a friend, introduce Raw Mission to your church, give us a 5-star rating, or write us a review. You could also become a regular partner in this ministry, perhaps by giving £10 or £20 a month, enabling us to keep growing our team here and sending more labourers to the harvest field. You could even join our team in the UK. We're often on the lookout for new staff, for advocates and mobilisers around the country, or for those of you with finance and administration gifts who could work with us here in the office. Thanks, guys. And now let's rejoin the interview. So this is a region, the Caucasus, that many of us know nothing about, but I think I'm right in saying it's very mountainous and lots of different tribes and people groups and so on. Yeah, describe a little bit more of the environment, or I don't know, what's the weather like there? What was it like for kids growing up there? Yeah.
So I fell in love with the place in that sense. It's mountainous. The high peaks go up to, 4,000 metres plus, and then there are a number of really high peaks that go up to about 5,500 metres. And it's just stunningly beautiful. There's glaciers, there's mountain pastures, there's shepherds and wolves and bears and skiing. Yeah, that's quite a big draw for me, I must confess. And I had the privilege of, on our days off, teaching my children how to ski over 10 years.
That's cool.
And, it was beautiful and wonderful. We took them walking, and my kids have touched a glacier. And they've been back and seen, what actual global warming means, because we've been to the same place, and the glacier had retreated 100 metres over 2 years. And so there's life lessons of living in that place that just sort of engaging with the world around us. So it was a beautiful environment in which to live. The post-Soviet communities that we were part of had a real knack of building really ugly communities right in the middle of really beautiful places. But you could get out of them and get up into the mountains, and it was wonderful.
So your living scenarios, was it very much concrete tower blocks and flats like that in the towns or small?
Yeah, it was. We lived on the 9th floor of a block of flats, but we had this amazing view of the mountains.
Yeah.
And the climate was so wonderful. I'm told that we had 300 days of sunshine a year. So,
and now you're in South Wales.
And now we're in South Wales, where we get 300 days of rain a year. But it was just such a wonderful climate, because being at altitude meant that the air was quite dry. And so the summers, although reasonably hot, being high up, they weren't super hot, and because they were dry, it wasn't that muggy heat. It was very tolerable as long as you kept out of the direct sun. And then the winters, although reasonably cold, not super cold. And again, with the dryness, it doesn't bite into your skin like damp cold. And we lived in this little bit of the valley that was between two bends, which meant that we got hardly any wind either. So although out in the big part of the valley, there could be really biting cold winds, in our little bit, it was desperately still. So it was just like this little corner of heaven, where the sun was shining nearly all the time.
No, that's good, because so many of our workers live in pretty highly polluted cities, especially in South Asia or Southeast Asia, or in very deserty places, just a lot of sand and dust and so on. And yet, folks like you guys who've lived in Central Asia or those kind of areas, it's very different.
What used to strike me was, you read in the Bible how God promised Israel a land flowing with milk and honey. And I always think of the Middle East as this sort of sandy wilderness. But actually where we lived was a land flowing with milk and honey. There were cattle on the hills, there were sheep on the hills, there were beehives, and literally you drive up over a mountain pass and there'd be a big lorry full of beehives and a stand where you could buy 3 kilos of honey
for £18.
For £18, yeah. So straight from the mountain pastures.
Wow.
And it was a land where the food was based on milk and honey and cattle and sheep. And it's like, this is what God was talking about.
Yeah, the pastoral sort of dream. It's great that you can find a lot to take pleasure in, when I'm sure other things were hard. Any other highlights you want to mention before I ask you about some of the really tough times out there?
Yeah, we had some really great relationships with this small group of local believers. We came into relationship with them really quite miraculously, in that we'd heard they existed, but we didn't know how to find them. And then we went down to our regional capital one day, and we couldn't go to the cafe that we wanted to go to, so we went in this other one that had a fake red telephone box outside. So we were like, we'll just go in there, it's actually open. And we were sitting down, and this lady came in and then walked out again. And I said to David, that looks like Katya that I used to know when I was in the region like 12, 15 years ago. It's like, wow. But she'd walked out again. I was like, oh, well, it can't have been her. And then she walked back in. I was like, it is. It's Katya. And we're like, come and sit down. And we sat down, and what are you doing here? And what are you doing? We said, well, we're here to serve this people group. And she's like, oh, I know a bunch of them who are believers. We're like,
Wow.
that's so amazing. Can you link us up? So through this chance meeting of us going into a cafe
On a date.
when we couldn't go to the cafe we wanted to, and just went in one with a red telephone box outside, and this person who I'd known 15 years ago walks in and knows the exact people we're looking for. And then we got to know this small group of believers, and I was able to tell a little story in their local language, and they just opened up their hearts to us in a way that would have taken, I don't know, a decade to do without speaking any of their language. And they were like, oh. And one of the ladies later said to me, when you told that story, that was the day I understood that God loved specifically our people group. Not just God loves everyone, but he loves our people group. Wow. And that was so special. And then seeing this group of believers grow in Christ, and 2 of them were married, and to see over the, I don't know how many years we were working with them, but both husbands really take strides forward from basically still saying they were Muslims before to basically now calling themselves followers of Jesus, was amazing. Seeing one of the couples, him really leaving a lot of his drinking behind, sorting out his life a lot. I mean, not perfect, but a lot better than when we first met them. And the other 2, they started to sort out their relationship somewhat. Both of them had daughters, and grown-up daughters, and they came to faith as well. So that was a real highlight, seeing them grow. And then we'd done a small translation project on something called The Prophet Story with these ladies, and there had been a translation in a very close language, and we'd got the audio done, and we played it to these ladies, and they went, oh no, that sounds like this other language we don't like. Oh no, that's terrible. So we were like, oh, okay, well, can you translate it? And so one of their number, they translated it. We redid the recording, and then we played it back to them, and they were like, oh yes, that is our language. At which point we understood that these 2 languages, although very, very close, the emotional reaction to the difference was very, very marked. And so we were able to advocate with 2 different Bible translation organisations that this people group needed their own translation. And so it took a while of going, no, just an adaptation is not enough. It really needs to be done by someone who understands this language from the inside. And so one of our ladies, she became the Old Testament translator, and that's what she does now. And
Wow, that's so cool.
Jonah has been published, and it's amazing.
We have it in a book at home. It's, a published book that since we left somebody has sent to us. It's in local language, English, and then the trade language. And, it's got pictures that they chose. They're a bit, I would consider them a bit cheesy, but that's what they chose. And it tells the story of Jonah. And it's the whole book. And we were told Jonah is one of those stories that people group particularly value. I mean, Jonah is a prophet in the Quran as well, I understand.
Yes, that's right, Yunus.
And so the story of Jonah, such as they know it, is valued, and the prayer of Jonah particularly. And so that's where they started. It's also conveniently a nice story to tell and short, which is good for a first-time translator.
That's great. It's also a key story that Jesus mentions in prophesying his own coming and his own resurrection.
Yes.
Wow, that's really good. Yeah, time's running out a little bit, so let's move on to some of the really tough things about life out there, or how it all ended.
Yeah, there was always a sense of, there is opposition here, and obviously for the local believers, that's not something that they can escape from. And this one lady who was the translator, her family situation was pretty chaotic, and 2 of her children actually were quite severely autistic, and her younger son in particular was very, very hard work. And one September morning, we just restarted our English teaching business again after the summer break. We spent all day at work, and we were on our way home to give our kids dinner, and we get a phone call saying, "We think our son's got a demon." At which point it's like, oh, okay, right, well, we'll give us an hour or two and we'll come. So they lived an hour and a half away across the mountains. And so we needed to go home and make sure the kids were fed and make sure they were okay. And we just spend an hour and a half sitting in the car praying and asking God for wisdom in the circumstances. And we get there and, you know, they've obviously had a really hard day as a family. As we said, the son is autistic and he smashed a window, I think by accident, partway through the day.
Well, at that point, he had a habit of hitting them.
Yeah, and so he'd smashed a window and he'd cut himself and he'd got upset, and then Dad and Mum had got upset and everyone started shouting at each other, and just by this time, Son was completely inconsolable and they couldn't control him, they couldn't do anything. And so we spent our hour and a half praying, and then by the time we arrived, I think he'd begun to calm down a bit. But, you know, we were able to talk to the Mum and Dad and sort of... We'd prayed about it. Do you know, we don't think this is demonic. It might be attack, but it's not demonic. And it gave me the opportunity to talk to the dad and say to him, you know, you are the head of this household. You know, biblically, you are the one who has the spiritual authority to pray for your family and speak protection over them. You know, I can pray for you for sure, and we will, and we are, and we do. But you, in this circumstance, need to declare your authority and God's protection over your son and over your wife and your other kids. And he was like, well, how do I do that? I mean, his trade language skills were actually about on a par with mine. He'd spent all his life in a village. He was a shepherd. And he says, I don't know how to pray. And I said, well, tell God what you want in your own language, which he did. And as far as I know, that's the first time he'd ever prayed out loud. And as he prayed, his son calmed down. And so it was an incredibly long evening. But I would say from that moment, he began to change. He began to see that there was a reason for faith and that faith made a difference.
Is it an environment where demons, jinns were talked about a lot, or is much focus landed there or not?
There is a certain amount of witchcraft, but I would say it's probably more along the women. I mean, Babushka there was into writing things on bits of paper and leaving them around the house, and eventually when daughter-in-law found out, she kicked stepmother out. Actually, she was a stepmother and a pretty unpleasant lady. Yeah.
So the grandma in that family, she would read fortunes from cards, and yes, there was people doing spells of different sorts, but it wasn't widely spoken about. They knew it wasn't totally Islamic, but there was an awful lot of it about. So there was well-known older ladies that ladies would go to for spells and such like, but actual demons not spoken about particularly either.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, but you know, actually, God used this hard day. For an increase in an increase. He did go on to be baptized eventually. His wife baptized him in the river, I think, didn't she? So it was a good day, but it was a hard day. So there were some stories like that.
Definitely. So you'd been in the country a decade or so when everything went wrong and you were asked to leave.
We'd been teaching English for a number of years, and we'd got to the point where, for whatever reason, we didn't feel it was really what we wanted to be doing, and we were beginning to look for ways to pivot towards something else. And that something else was going to be, we had a nice vision for a place of prayer up in the mountains, a retreat centre, and we'd even marked out a property that we wanted to buy. We got the money together to buy it, and I was setting out one bright Friday morning to go and meet somebody and arrange the deal to buy the place. I thought, do you know what, I'm going to pop into the post office, see if we've got any post. Go into the post office. Oh, yeah, there's something for us. Open it up. And it's a letter saying your residency visa has been annulled. And I'm not brilliant at reading the trade language particularly well. And so instead of getting on the road, I go back home, show it to Abigail and say, this does mean what I think it means, doesn't it? And she's like, oh, yes. And the letter that said, you need to go down to the regional capital, to the offices down there, and come in. And the letter, I think, gave 10 days or 2 weeks notice to leave.
Yeah, similar to what we had.
And so, again, it's an hour's journey in the car, and we immediately start sending out to our WhatsApp or whatever group it was, prayer warriors, this has happened, please pray, and off I go. And I get down there, and usually what happens, somebody looks at your passport, takes it off you and stamps it immediately, and that's it. But for whatever reasons that day, the lady was just going off on lunch, and she said, come back after lunch. And so I'm sort of casting around, what do I do? Where do I get some advice? And so I go into one of the little bureaucratic offices that are sort of along the sides. They're just little offices where people help you fill in the forms. They're not part of the official sort of structure. And I say, this has happened, and they're all a bit baffled. Is there somebody I can talk to? And they say, well, actually, just today, there's a lawyer in here who can help you. And so I show it to this lady, and she is outraged and says, you can fight this. You don't have to give them your passport. You don't have to do X, Y, and Z. And so after lunch, she comes with me into the offices and marches around and shouts at people and doesn't let them take my passport and my residency document. And so my residency document is not cancelled. And she then enables us to initiate an appeal through the courts. Had that document been stamped, had that lady said, no, I'm not going to go on lunch, I'm going to do my job now, she would have stamped that, and that would have been it. And so the appeal process started, and it meant that we were able to stay another 10 months while things worked through. And there were highs and lows in that. You know, there were a number of court appearances, we had lawyers, and I think for me, maybe I don't have enough imagination, but I was the one sat in court, and so I wasn't in control of the circumstances, but I didn't have to imagine what was going on. It was harder for Abigail, who was sat in the entryway, who wasn't allowed through into the courtroom, who had to sit there imagining what might be going on. And usually a court case went on for 10, 15, 20 minutes, maybe half an hour, and that was it.
Did you get to the bottom of what was happening, why they were turfing you out?
No, they used similar security laws to what they've used on many other people, including quite well-known journalists and so on. And our lawyer, we got a different lawyer eventually, and he had all of the right qualifications and certification to be told state secrets, and he wasn't told either. It was simply that the government decided that they didn't want us. It eventually became clear that even if we were in the unlikely situation where we won the court case, that the police and so on would find other ways to end our time there, at which point we made the decision to leave. But we left on our own terms. How
did it make you feel?
It's been devastating to leave.
For
me, I think my identity was more wrapped up in that part of the world, because at age 14, I was like, wow, Soviet Union, that whole sphere of the world, and my identity was very much wrapped up in being there. And then to be kicked out and banned was like, well, who am I now?
Right.
Plus, basically, our whole kid's childhood had been spent in this place. And now to not even be able to go back and visit and go, oh, do you remember when we did this? It's been very hard. So, yeah, devastating. But part of the story of us leaving is we have managed to leave a legacy. So I think David's going to talk about that.
Yeah, so shortly after we received this letter and had our first sort of interactions, we got an invitation to a denominational, I think it was denominational, what they called a missionary square. It was a gathering to talk about mission.
Just to note, in that context, mission is what we would call church planting.
Okay.
It's not cross-cultural mission, it's starting new churches in the next town or whatever.
From the existing believers that weren't necessarily from a Muslim background?
Yes. Okay. So we went to this, but we were invited on the basis that you guys have been there for 10 years. What are you doing? That's really impressive. And where you live, there's no Russians there. Why are you there? Are you not scared? That kind of stuff.
Yeah, so because of the Soviet Union, Russians are in pockets all over the former Soviet Union. In all the countries that are now independent, there are pockets of Russians. So wherever you go, you are likely to find a ethnic Russian church.
Okay.
And so we were able to talk to these guys and say, well, this is what we've been doing. We didn't come here for you guys. We didn't come here to help you build your church. You're able to do that. But there is no church amongst these people. And very few of you are doing any outreach to them. And none of you are modelling that to the few believers that there are. They have had to take on your cultural norms and identity to fit in. And so actually they don't want that. They don't want to be Russians.
Yeah.
They want to be their own thing. And we had the opportunity to say that to them and to say, there are all these people who need to meet Jesus, who will not walk into your church, and who need you to take off your own cultural identity and be, like Paul said, all things to all men. You need to be Jews to the Jews and Greeks to the Greeks.
And because we'd had this letter by that point, we were able to say, look, and you can't rely on foreigners to come in and do it, because we're almost certainly leaving soon, and you can't be kicked out of the country for doing this. This is your country. You have the passports of this country, and you're not breaking any laws. This has to be your bag. This has to be something that you do.
It really struck home, didn't it? There was a real shock in people's faces. They were, oh no, you're not going to be kicked out. It'll be fine. And it wasn't. We had the opportunity. Our 10 weeks was actually 10 days was actually more like 10 months. And so 6 months later, we got invited back to the next edition of this. And it was all about cross-cultural mission. It was all about how do we reach out effectively to Muslims on our doorstep that we've always seen as kind of the same as us. And since then, one of those leaders has actually gone on to help our little group of people continue to gather, continue to work towards their translations. And it's not without its issues and niggles, but it's continuing. And this little group are meeting to do translation work every week and building fellowship and building identity. And it's just a joy to see it. And, there's part of me that thinks, well, had we not been kicked out, we wouldn't have had this story to tell these guys to give them the kick in the pants to understand that it was their job.
Yeah, that's really interesting. We know from all over the world there are places where foreigners have gone and really helped start things, but then things have taken off when they've left, whether by their own choice or not. So it's so hard in the moment, isn't it? Your dreams, everything is just crashing around you, and you're not sure what's happening and why it's happening, and should you fight it, should you not fight it, and people are praying for you and asking you, what are you going to do, what are you going to do? But I suppose you've been back a few years, and you've had some chance to look back, and you can see a little bit of the hand of God, at least in that scenario of the Russians taking some ownership.
And I think the other thing to note is that nobody, as far as we knew before us, had challenged these orders in the courts. Nobody even thought it was possible. And I think that since we did that, at least one other person's done the same. I'm not sure it's changed the outcome, but it spoke to our group of ladies and husbands and things that they were worth fighting for.
Yeah.
Rather than just rolling over, packing our bags and leaving. And I think that was appreciated, that they have value and we're not just going to take no for an answer necessarily.
And they get to walk with you as you're grieving that loss.
Yeah.
And that's powerful for them because, you know, there will be things they lose by turning to Christ from their Muslim cultures, and they can, you know, see something of an example there that you're taking some hits as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, I really appreciate your stories. Any final thoughts, scriptures that sustained you? Any advice to those who might be thinking of going to do the kind of things you've been doing, or things you wish you'd done differently?
I think for me, having been with YWAM in the 90s, like the 90s was a very special time in the former Soviet Union. There was just such immense openness by almost everyone to things that were Western. And people, in air quotes, became Christians, like left, right and centre. And when we went as a family, a decade later, things were very, very different. And I don't know that we ever would have expressed it like this, but we felt that we were going to plant a church. And it very quickly became clear that we weren't going to plant a church, that this was not the 90s anymore. Things were far more difficult, and we weren't in the big city where people are more open to Westerners anyway. We were up in the mountains where people are very wedded to their way of life and their culture. And so I think we had to change tack. But I think another thing that I really learned is that prayer is the work. We often think that we're going to do work and we pray to support the work. But actually we learnt that prayer is the work. Being on the ground, praying, and praying for God's presence, praying that he will lead you to the right people. And anything else just flows out of that, rather than going with a program and asking God to bless it. We so often do things completely upside down. We go with this amazing idea and program that we're going to do, and then pray to support it. But actually, prayer is the work, and then other things come out of that.
Do you want to share any stories about how you saw prayers answered?
On one occasion, Abigail went up into the mountains. I dropped her up there with a bicycle, and she cycled back. And at a particular point on the road, there was this place where there were a couple of large rocks that were revered locally as a sort of pagan place. They were called sort of the keystones of that people group, and there was this sense of anything beyond this has never been taken. It's our homeland, and it's protected by these rocks. And as you approached the place, Abigail got this sense of, why are you doing this? Why are you here? Go away. There's no point doing this. And just sort of overwhelmed by despair. And eventually you got to the point where it was like, these thoughts aren't my thoughts. Get out. But we identified them as being sort of focused on these rocks. And so we began to go up there and to pray and to listen to God there, to take communion there. And on one occasion, we went there, and while we were taking communion, we just prayed. It was right next to a river. It had been nicely landscaped, and we prayed, and there was this wall against the river holding the river back, and we prayed that the wall would fall down and the place would be washed away. And, you know, it was kind of, I can't say it was prayed with any great faith. It was like, it's a metre thick wall. It's not going to fall in. It's built of huge rocks. But we prayed it nonetheless. And then a month or so later, we went back. I mean, just because we were going for a walk up in the mountains, not even to go there. And we got to the other side of the river and looked across, and this wall had fallen into the river. I mean, I don't know that anyone became a believer on the back of it, but we went there with this other local friend, and we got her to pray in her language. And at that moment, we kind of felt that things began to unlock further up this valley that was this homeland, and where there was this sense of, no, you are not welcome here. And in her language, she had invited Jesus into this space. And it really began to change things in the sort of physical realm. People, it was right next to parts of the world where tourists really ought to be going a lot because of the beauty, but nothing was happening there, and suddenly you started seeing adverts pop up for this space.
Interesting.
And it was interesting. I can't claim that it was this prayer that unlocked the whole world, but
sure,
it was like it was really striking. We'd prayed for a wall to fall down, and a wall fell down. And I don't know that that's a coincidence.
Yeah, we have no idea.
But
what in the spiritual realm is changing and happening by our presence there, and our prayers, and our witnessing to people, and they're all somehow interweaving with each other, aren't they? And
and I mean, I think what for us it said was that our prayers are there to undermine the spiritual walls, and as Abigail said, the business is prayer, and it's the prayer that undermines the spiritual strongholds of the world.
Exactly.
For me, one of the strongest things is every time we prayed for a relationship that would be significant, God answered reasonably quickly those prayers, and in quite amazing ways.
Throughout our time being kicked out, we just had a daily practice of learning to sit quietly in the presence of God in the morning, just simply in silence. And that sustained us for 10 months and into our time when we came back. Were we not doing that, I'm not sure we would have got through it. It was pretty traumatic as it was, but we got through it, and it was that sense of peace and presence. And it was hard, but God walked with us in the hardness. He didn't promise to protect us from difficulties and trials, but he has promised to walk through it with us, and that's been our experience.
As we close, why should people consider going to the Caucasus region?
Because it's great.
Apart from the skiing.
I think there are many different people there. There are opportunities if people are bold to look for them. I would say that the context has changed in the 15 years or so since we arrived, and you may have to go to a different country now. There are other places that are slightly more open within that region, and there are places that are now sort of acting as training bases, if you like, for people coming to the area to help people acclimatise to the culture and the languages and the nations, and then potentially move on somewhere else after a couple of years. And we had the privilege, actually, of Greg Livingston coming and visiting us some years ago. And we talked to him about, no one's been praying for this region. There's nothing happening here because no one's been praying for this place. You look at elsewhere in the Muslim world, there's this amazing stuff happening. But there's been a history of prayer into those places for years beforehand often. And there's nobody doing that. And his response to us was, yeah, that's right, but also you need people on the ground. And so in those other places where there's stuff happening, there's also been that history of long, faithful, apparently fruitless ministry with prayer involved for many years. And suddenly things have then taken off. But there's not been any of that really in the Caucasus. There hasn't been a long history of either presence of people or prayer in the place, for the place, or simply just prayer for the place from outside.
And at the end of the day, there are dozens of people groups there with very little witness and no believers, and in lots of them.
There's over 50 people groups.
Okay, over 50 people groups. So many opportunities to go where the gospel's never gone before. I hope our listeners will take up that challenge to pray for the Caucasus, and that some maybe will feel a stirring in their spirit that God is drawing them to that region of the world, and they can easily get in touch with you through us. And perhaps the Lord will lead you back there one day. Is that part of your dream?
Yes, we do dream of going back to the region. We can't go back to the country where we were before. But there is a certain amount of shared culture between all of the countries in that region, and our heart is there. It's definitely so beautiful. The people are wonderful and infuriating all at the same time. But we love it.
Great. Well, may the Lord bless you in that and prepare you and bring you back to the land that you've you've loved for many, many years. Thanks for being with me today, guys. It's been great. Really good to hear your stories.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, God bless. Bye. Thanks so much for joining us today, guys. Do get in touch if you want to share how God is speaking to you through the podcast, or if you want to partner with us in raising up more workers for the harvest. You can email me personally, matt@frontiers.org.uk. Here's a great quote to end with from J.L. Ewan. As long as there are millions destitute of the Word of God and knowledge of Jesus Christ, it will be impossible for me to devote time and energy to those who have both. Have a great week and make sure you don't miss our next episode.